While I was writing this, I was thinking, how sad and how tragic the melting pot is of both London and New York, and I guess America as a whole. But then this thing emerges from the melting pot. I think maybe more so in America, this sort of fusion of, in this case, being an American and being Jewish. It becomes this new type of person maybe emerges. And I think I was just constantly changing my mind, not only about the melting pot, but about so many things in this book, this never ending search for a Jewish refuge.
That was Rachel Cockerell, author of the critically acclaimed book Melting Point: Family, Memory, and the Search for the Promised Land. This experimental work is a collection of archival material stripped entirely of a narrator's voice, thread together only by the logic of deeply researched materials at hand. Can a compelling history be written purely with citations? How have scholars and storytellers used archives to document and narrate Jewish experience? How can archives and archivists shape storytelling? I'm Shayna Hammerman, and this is Cite and Sound, the Stanford Jewish Studies podcast. Here we host conversations with scholars and artists as we explore Jewish scholarship, culture, and history. On today's episode, Cockerell joins Ari Kelman, the Jim Joseph Professor of Education and Jewish Studies at Stanford, to share insights into Cockerell's engrossing account of American Jewish experience traced from an idea of Zion to a pilgrimage to Galveston, Texas, to the theaters of New York City, and to Jewish family homes in London before, during, and after World War II. We start here with an introduction to Cockerell's work by Professor Kelman. And now, the conversation.
Melting Point tells a story that's at once expansive and intimate, with connections to England, New York, Mandatory Palestine, Israel, and, in a plot twist, Galveston, Texas. It's a brilliant work of really, really accessible, readable, and even exciting scholarship. And I don't think I'm alone among scholars who wish that they had thought of writing a book like this before she did it so well. Rachel is a writer and historian. She's born and raised in London, and Melting Point is actually her first book, which makes it all that more impressive. It's an experimental history, as you all know, sewn together out of the primary documents of both sort of issues of global import, but also from her family's own biography about her family's search for a promised land. It centers around the Galveston movement, which you read about in the book, a long-forgotten project that brought about 10,000 Russian Jews to Texas before World War I, and they were led by Rachel's great-grandfather. Melting Point has been widely reviewed and universally praised for its thoughtful content and innovative style, and it has been longlisted for the Bale Gifford Prize for Nonfiction. So I'm going to turn it over, and please join me in welcoming Rachel Cockerell.
Thank you so much, Ari, and thank you all for coming. This is my first time west of Texas, so I'm, big fan of your coast. Ari mentioned that some of you want to know a bit about the writing process and the process of putting together a strange book like this. Some of it was done in archives. This was actually in Jerusalem. I did most of my research during COVID. But I did a lot of archival research in America, and also I did a lot of research online. And actually, the archival research, it feels very inefficient. You're leafing through this endless stuff, and most of it's rubbish, and you come across sort of one line every sort of 6 days that, that makes it all worthwhile. Yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about the process. As you guys know, the book is formed entirely of primary sources, which even as I say those words, I can feel, I can feel the person I'm telling to, I can feel their heart sort of sinking, because all of those words sound sort of boring and confusing, and, you don't really know what they mean. But it just really means I've cut out the middleman, that I'm not in it, and I wanted the story to be told through the eyes of those who were there. I was inspired by Lincoln in the Bardo by George Saunders, which is the story of Abraham Lincoln and his son Willie Lincoln, who gets ill and dies during the Civil War. And it's told partly through real first-hand accounts from the time, or, people who wrote memoirs years later. And this book it sort of gave me permission to include primary sources which contradicted each other. So I just want to read this out as an example. This is a moment that takes place in the White House. Abraham Lincoln and his wife throw a big party. Meanwhile, their son Willie is upstairs in bed, getting iller and iller. So this is, yeah, it's kind of like my book. Obviously, I kind of copied him. Snippets from different people's memoirs. So I'll just read out the each source without their attributions. By the time dinner was served, the moon shone high and small and blue above, still bright, albeit somewhat diminished. The night continued dark and moonless. A storm was moving in. The guests began to depart as the full yellow moon hung among the morning stars. The clouds were heavy, leaden, and low, of a dull roseate colour. There was no moon. My husband and I paused to look up at the room in which young Lincoln suffered. I said a silent prayer for the health of the lad. We found the carriage and made for home, where our own children, thanks be to a merciful God, were resting peacefully. There's a line in my book, you can't trust witnesses. And you think, if you can't trust witnesses, who can you trust? And I guess writing this book and also reading George Saunders's book made me think more about memory. And, we've all heard that phrase, memory is a photocopy of a photocopy. And each time you retrieve a memory from the sort of library inside your mind, you sort of distort it a bit. And it's such a sort of watery, unreliable thing. I'm sure you've all had moments when you're sort of reminiscing about something with your friends and everyone's saying, it wasn't like that, it was like this. So this passage in particular gave me permission to include all these memories which seem to contradict each other. And there's a moment early in my book which I kind of put in there almost as a tribute to Lincoln in the Bardo. So this is Theodor Herzl and Israel Zangwill. Herzl was a journalist living in Vienna who sort of almost accidentally founded the modern Zionist movement. He wrote, if this doesn't work out, at least I can make it into a novel. I think he sort of thought that maybe he would be returning to his newspaper articles pretty soon after. This would be a rapid failure. And on his left is a forgotten English playwright and novelist called Israel Zangwill, who sort of became Herzl's sidekick. And they both wrote about the first time they met each other. Zangwill wrote, "He was a man of striking personal beauty with a long black beard and glowing eyes and the face of the old Assyrian kings. His manner was courtly, his conversation fascinating." Herzl wrote, "Our conversation is laborious. We speak in French, his command of which is inadequate. I don't even know whether he understands me. Still, we agree on major points." And Zangwill wrote, "A black-bearded stranger knocked at my study door like one dropped from the skies and said, 'I am Theodor Herzl, help me to rebuild the Jewish state.'" And even as you're reading those and these two people are having wildly different memories of the same event in the same room, the same day and the same time, you kind of feel like you're there. Everyone's experience of things is subjective, and you can kind of be a fly on the wall and see how two people are sort of misinterpreting things so dramatically. One other thing I just wanted to talk about, if any of you are interested in sort of, I guess, creative nonfiction or even fiction, I shouldn't say or even fiction. This is an idea which I guess primarily applies to fiction, but I think it also applies to nonfiction. Another idea plagiarized from George Saunders. He talks about the needle in your head or the meter in your head. And he says that as you're reading back over your own work, I'm sure all of you have had this, where you're reading back and you think, this is kind of bad and I don't know why it's bad, but it's so bad and I'm going to fail this class and I shouldn't even be here at Stanford. What a disaster. And that's a sort of zoomed out view. You read something and you just think it's generally bad. You make a sort of sweeping statement about your own work, or you could do it about someone else's work. And George Saunders' advice is to zoom in. As you're reading something, perhaps the first sentence you think, oh, it's not too bad. It's pretty good, actually. And then maybe, so this needle in your head is sort of swinging between positive and negative, and you have to watch for when the needle in your head goes to the negative. And so this is something that you should be doing as you're reading back your own work. And also if you're researching something, if you're reading a long article, watch the needle in your head, because everyone will have a different sense of what sort of strikes them. But most of my sort of years of researching this book was reading these sort of deathly boring long articles from 100 or 125 years ago and filleting them, selecting one little line or one paragraph which struck me for some reason, which sort of pleased me. And so this is actually the first page of the book. I found this article about Herzl written in, I think, 1901 by someone who had met him in London. And it's quite a long article, and as I was reading it, my needle was sort of swinging wildly. There are some parts in this article which are very dramatic, sort of melodramatic. There are cliches. There are bits that I just didn't even really understand and that I knew no other 21st century person would understand. But there were also moments, just phrases or lines here and there, which leapt out at me. So I'm going to read this whole article out loud. And as I'm reading, your mind is going to start to drift and you're going to think, why am I even here? This is so boring. I wonder if it's too rude to leave. But maybe there will also be moments that you like. So I'm going to just set a quick task, which is, as I read this out, watch the needle in your head and and see as it swings whether it is in the positive or the negative, and not only say to yourself, oh, that sentence was bad. Ask yourself why. Try and pinpoint, is it because it's a cliche? Is it because it's just opaque to me? It's been sort of lost in translation over the course of the century from which it was written. So yeah, here we go. A year ago, while I was drinking afternoon tea in a London drawing room, entered a tall, lithe man with coal-black hair, beard and moustaches, restless visionary eyes, and a nervous mouth twitching with half-sad humour. I did not know him, but he magnetised me immediately. I intuitively divined the intensity of his personal force, the rich radiance of his character, the passionate idiosyncrasy of his soul. At that time, Zionism was a mere shibboleth to me, one of the husks that are blown about the social and political highway. But the moment I saw this modern Moses, this practical prophet, Zionism became a vivid reality. For I recognized him at once as one of those apostles who worked miracles by the power of their will and the empire of their egotism. At that time, Herzl could not speak a word of English. After a few commonplaces, he drifted away again, leaving me profoundly interested in his romantic genius. He had done nothing, said nothing, but he had been himself. Now the man who can be himself in a drawing room is rare, and this man's self was so bizarre, so disturbing, so strange, that I caught myself wondering at its persistence in my mind. Why should I keep in my memory so clear a picture of Herzl, when so many other men and women fade out of it like shadows of shadows? Well, the other day I met Herzl again in another drawing room, the drawing room of the Hotel Cecil. Okay, spoiler alert, the rest is very boring, so I'll stop there. So hopefully, as I was reading, you were watching your needle and maybe there were lines that you liked. These were the lines that I hated and the lines I liked. So all the bits crossed out in red I hated. They were so dramatic, so over the top, they didn't really make sense to me. But there were also lines that seemed to me sort of the opposite of cliche, which I think is original, a thought that had never really occurred to me before, or at least I'd never articulated to myself. My favorite one is, why should I keep in my memory so clear a picture of Herzl when so many other men and women fade out of it like shadows of shadows? And I think this is quite a timeless experience. We've all had this where someone can tell you their name 100 times and you still can't really remember them and don't really care about them. And then there are other people who live rent-free in your head, as your generation says. So from this passage, I made the first page of my book. And I guess that this echoes the rest of the book in that every page of the book, there has been sort of 3 other pages that have been crossed out, scribbled out in red. So maybe I'll stop there and then we can talk.
What was the historical discovery that had the biggest impact on you in writing the book?
Ooh, wow. A sweeping question to start. I mean, I think it was more about the tiny, small things. And I hope that's not like a cheating. But I think at school and sort of at university as well, it was all about these big, sweeping historical events and historical figures and dates to remember. And I think the problem with a lot of history teaching is not zooming in and seeing these historical figures as humans with human foibles, all their strange little habits. Like there's one line I love about Herzl that I think it's early in the book, he dressed so well that, one of his friends had done his tie so nicely that night and was so proud of himself, and Herzl sort of just glanced at his tie and crushed him. Really we think of Herzl, we're taught about Herzl that he was this grand statesman-like figure. And so it was always about humanizing people, and I think small details can sort of take you into the story.
On that same theme, you go about The book goes from sort of very big public history to these very intimate stories of your family, your
Yeah.
extended family. How did you decide to shift the scope from the larger historical themes to the real focus on the intimate details like life at 22 Mapesbury Road and the families living
Yeah.
upstairs, downstairs?
I think it was partly that this is a 20th century story, and at the time, there wasn't a sense of historical figures and sort of normal people. Everyone was sort of jumbled together. So that's why that as you're reading the book, maybe you'll glance into the margin and see a name you recognized, but it's sort of mixed in with all these other names that you don't recognize. And I think that's how life is, that everyone's sort of mixed in together. So I guess I wanted to sort of reflect that, but also I think I wanted to sort of follow where this story took me. I think people talk about that with fiction. You're sort of trying to be led by your characters and led by the story and not trying to shoehorn it into what you want it to be. And I tried to do the same with this story. And it felt a bit strange that a story would start with, the founding of Zionism and end with my dad as a boy in post-war North London. But that seemed to be what the story wanted to be, to get a bit sort of mystical about it.
You said in the afterword that you initially didn't expect to center Zangwill in the way that you did. Like, did Zangwill just like keep intruding on the story you were trying to tell? How did it happen that he ended up being such a big character, particularly in that first half of the book?
Yeah, the sort of slightly like hippie way of thinking of it. It felt like he was insisting on being more and more of a presence in the book. And then the more sort of maybe rational way of thinking about it is that there was just so much material about him, and much of it was so good. I think with an approach like this, you're not even really in control. It's the archives and what you can find. And I found so much stuff that I loved about him that informed the way I told the story.
Did you know much about him before you started this
Never
project?
heard his name, which is so sad because he is responsible for my existence and my family being in London. I feel like he should have been a name that was known, at least in my family, but he'd been forgotten.
When was it that you decided to pull your own writing out and just present the material in the way that you did? It wasn't just Lincoln and the Bardo. How did you come to that decision? Because
Yeah.
it's pretty consequential to the
Yeah.
whole thing.
There were a few sort of seeds that had been planted. One of them was Lincoln in the Bardo. Another one was a documentary which I recommend to everyone here, called Apollo 11. Actually, I especially recommend it to you and anyone else who is interested in space, but also anyone who's not interested in space. It's about the moon landing, but this guy discovered that the people at ground control had been filming everything, and also that the astronauts had been filming everything in the rocket. And also there's all this audio sort of archive stuff. So you're watching this film, and in theory it's a documentary because it's all made of archival material. But because there are no sort of talking heads and people like a modern historian, talking, historicizing, it feels more like a feature film than a documentary. So I had watched that and I thought, wow. So there's like a moment when they're literally landing on the moon and there's just a shot of the moon sort of like looming towards the viewer, getting closer and closer, and then eventually you, the viewer, land on the moon yourself. And I thought, how interesting, the power of not having a middleman. The other thing, I don't know if any of you listened to This American Life, but I had just heard Ira Glass in an interview talk about he loved having tape to tape transitions, i.e., two snippets of interviews without the host of whatever that radio segment was intervening. He just wanted to go from one snippet to the next. So yeah, it was a few things that those things sort of gave me permission, and then also I just instinctively was shuddering at my own voice in there, my own interjections.
Yeah, because all my historian friends were like, "She did what?" You showed the blueprints of the house or something
Oh,
in a way that was like incredibly well done, but also just like, "Oh, right, that's what my work looks like before I put all the other stuff in there, and maybe I need less of that other stuff."
mm.
How'd you keep it all organized?
At school, I think I was like the last generation not to have laptops and iPads and everything in class, and in theory, I'm grateful to that I didn't have a screen education, but in practice, I am and was the most disorganized person I know. And as soon as I would, write some class notes, those class notes would just drift away from me into the wind. I would lose everything. And, at school and not so much at university, but at school, the papers that I did salvage from being lost were all sort of stuffed into these huge files, which was a bit bent and broken. And I did 5 subjects at A level, as we call it in England, when you're 17, and all the subject. I didn't have a file for each subject. It was all a disaster. So I think just having a computer kind of helped. But I used Google Docs at first. I would make these notes, and then anyone who uses Google Docs, if you make like a document that's like 200 pages long, it kind of takes a while to load and it sort of feels like it might crash. So every time I would reach 200 pages, I would make a new Google Doc. So I had notes 1, 2, 3, 4, up to I think 12 or something. And then eventually I used Scrivener, which is an app. It's kind of an alternative to Microsoft Word, and you can arrange everything into chapters and scenes and moments in those scenes. There's a sort of sidebar, and then you can click and drag each of these sections in the sidebar. So for any essay that you write, I really recommend it. It felt a bit like printing everything out and laying it on the floor and rearranging everything, or having a huge corkboard. Life-changing. I have another book, at least I think in the works is putting it a bit strongly, but I have another book in mind, and I hope to use the same or a similar format again, just because I think that I want to show that this form is so versatile that as long as you have a mountain of source material, you can really apply this form of writing to anything. But also, this idea of being led by what the book wants, blah blah blah, is that not feeling wedded to a particular, not sort of boxing yourself in, or feeling like you've got to adhere to a certain framework. So I'm going to try and sort of be open-minded and go in with an open heart. I was also writing a diary while I was writing this book, and in that diary, I was putting all the things I was feeling at the time, all the struggles of like, I'll never finish this, like, this is always gonna be an eternal Google Doc. So if you guys ever feel that way, just know that you will finish it one day. But also, I think the thing that I was feeling, and the thing that I kind of wish I had been able to put in the book, or the thing that I lost by not having my own voice in there, was this feeling of the uncanny, this feeling that all these sort of ghosts were around me all the time. Like, I had a dream that my grandfather, Hugh, who's the sort of reserved Englishman whom my grandmother married, who I never met, I had a dream that he had just been sitting at the table all the time, and that he was so quiet that I had just not noticed that he was still alive. And someone said to me, "Oh, you really ought to interview Hugh." And I had said, "Oh, it hadn't occurred to me." So all these just small feelings of this grey boundary between the dead and the living. And, the fact that my great grandfather was born in 1869, and that Jo, who is now in her 90s, still remembers him. The fact that people who seem to belong to another era are still alive in people's minds. All of that sort of ghost type stuff is gone.
Now I want to sort of pull away from the craft and more toward the ideas that were brought up in the book. Do you think that home is about a physical place, the people you're surrounded by, or the stories that you carry?
Oh, the line that immediately came to mind was Joe. I don't know if any of you have got to part 2 yet, but my great grandfather had a son called Joe Bache, who was a playwright in New York, and he had a daughter in 1930 who he decided to name Joe Bache II. And she is now in her 90s, and I sort of interviewed her at length, and she said her mother is from North Carolina and her father is a Russian Jew, a Russian Jewish New Yorker. And she said about her mother, who moved from North Carolina to New York, "Where you're raised has its hands on you no matter where you go." And she was saying that her mother was a Southern belle, even though she was in New York. And her mother would always talk about down home. And then also, my grandmother's sister, who eventually moved from London to Jerusalem, would always talk about back home, at home, at home. And she would always eat cornflakes as sort of quintessentially English breakfast, instead of eating the sort of typical Israeli breakfast. And they were very expensive. And even me being in America, I kind of think like, oh, maybe I'm an American now. But actually, I think you can't escape. You can't escape the place you were raised.
It seemed that turning the narrative of the story over to the characters freed you up in a whole lot of ways. Were there ways that it also constrained you, where you maybe wish they had said more or said less, where you felt like you couldn't do certain things because the historical record didn't let you?
I remember having a few of those thoughts early in the process. Like, there's a moment when Zangwill gets married and also Herzl dies. And I thought, what a sort of moving story it would be if Zangwill's dear friend and hero, Theodor Herzl, dies, and Zangwill's so heartbroken, but then he meets a woman and then gets married and he mends his broken heart. But unfortunately, that's not the order that it happened in. It happened in the opposite order. And I kind of thought, I wonder if I can shoehorn it into being the version of the story that'd be better. And then I remembered that you have to let the story go where it wants to go. And I tried to sort of lay it out properly. And actually, that was much more effective. There were times when I thought, I'm in the right and these characters are in the wrong. And then I eventually always sort of surrendered and realized that they probably knew better than me.
So how did writing the book change your perspective on the idea of assimilation as a survival strategy versus loss of kind of cultural coherence or integrity?
I mean, this word that we hear so much, bittersweet, I think is sort of underrated. I am a product of the melting pot. My grandmother was born, Russian was her mother tongue. She was born in the Russian Empire. She probably thought of herself as a Russian Jew. And then she came to London, decided to become more English than the English, and married a nice sort of stiff upper lip, reserved Englishman, and had nice English children who had nice English children themselves, one of whom was me. And I feel a sense of loss that this heritage or this heirloom that could have been passed down to me wasn't. And I wonder, I know that I don't even know how much I've lost. The things that were in my grandmother's head when she was my age are not the same things that are in my head. While I was writing this, I was thinking, how sad and how tragic the melting pot is of both London and New York, and I guess America as a whole. But then this thing emerges from the melting pot. I think maybe more so in America, this sort of fusion of, in this case, being an American and being Jewish. It becomes this new type of person maybe emerges. And I think I was just constantly changing my mind, not only about the melting pot, but about so many things in this book, this never-ending search for a Jewish refuge. Each idea, I was thinking maybe it would have been great, and then changing my mind a second later. And I think that thing of bittersweetness and never being quite sure of yourself is something important.
You just mentioned that your concept, your understanding of certain concepts evolved as the book evolved. If you could speak specifically about how your relationship to or understanding of Zionism changed, either from before writing or during writing or even since.
I must confess that I knew very little about Zionism before I started writing this book. Like, really, it was such a vague notion in my head. My excuse is that I was, well, I was going to say my excuse was that I was like 21, but you guys are all around that age and you probably know a lot more than me. But my excuse is that I was a bit of an idiot and maybe still am. But I think that actually being an outsider trying to write about something which you have no foundation of knowledge about is a good thing. I did a master's in journalism, and my journalism teacher was reporting on the troubles in Ireland, and he knew nothing about them. He was in Ireland for 6 years, and he said that his articles that he wrote at the beginning of those 6 years were much better than at the end of those 6 years. You have to sort of illuminate yourself and therefore illuminate your reader if you have to start from square one. In terms of how my understanding of Zionism has changed, I think that the conversations today are so much about Zionism post 1948, and I think it's important, no matter how you feel about it, to go back to the start and see how this all started.
You really contrast Zangwill's sort of Zionism without Zion and Herzl's like more land centered, even though what the land is kind of moves around a couple of times. So how do you interpret given their relationship, how do you interpret the ideological fracture? Was it just like a practical thing that one saw a certain path forward more readily than the other? Or was there like a deeper philosophical rift over the sort of nature of Jewish nationhood?
Between Herzl and
Herzl and
Zangwill,
Zangwill.
I originally thought there was a fracture. But actually, again, this was being led by the story. The more I read about it, the more I got the sense that Herzl dies sort of almost, it feels like the failure of the Uganda plan is almost a cause in his death, the stress that created in Herzl. And it felt like, I at least felt that Zangwill created Jewish territorialism to preserve Herzl's legacy, or to sort of continue Herzl's legacy. He was saying Herzl wanted Uganda as a Jewish refuge, or at least a temporary Jewish refuge. And he was right that we must just find somewhere for now. That was my sense of it, that Zangwill was so broken by Herzl's death that he wanted to continue his legacy in some way.
And that led to Galveston.
And that led to Galveston. So yeah, so Galveston was almost a legacy of Herzl. It's sort of, yeah, strange to think about.
Did you look in, the rabbi of Galveston was super interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Was there stuff you left out? I mean, he seemed like the Energizer Bunny.
Yeah.
He had all his energy. He was down at the port every day.
Yeah, on his bike, yeah. I actually had a whole scene of the rabbi of Galveston getting married, his wedding day. And then I was like, this is irrelevant. And I think there were a few moments in the book which were irrelevant, but I sort of indulged myself. Like there's a moment when I think the rabbi of Galveston he's like singing a hymn or something, and it says like the organ player, Mr. like Schweitzman, played with more than his usual skill level. There were little moments when I allowed myself to go off piste a little bit, but I had to leave out a fair bit about the rabbi.
I think in the after you say you had to, your editor made you cut it down from like 120,000 words, like 90,000 words. It's like a quarter.
Yeah.
Were there other really juicy bits that you wanted to keep in that you had to pull out?
I mean, luckily I blocked them out if there were any. It's something that my dad said to me, which I have included, I think, in the acknowledgements, and I think is quite useful, maybe for all of you as well, and for anyone who's writing essays, that editing or specifically cutting down at first feels like cutting off your fingernails. It's sort of, oh, it's a bit better, I didn't need that, and then cutting off your fingers, and then cutting off your hands, and then cutting off your arms. It gets more and more painful, and you think, I can't possibly lose that. And I did feel like that there were things which that hurt me to let go of, and yet now reading it back, I think I spot things. I think like, oh, I want to cut that as well. So it's kind of addictive.
After tracing so many different versions of the Promised Land, do you still think the idea of a homeland holds power today, or is it just like maybe better thought of as like a metaphor for belonging more generally?
Yeah, homeland. It's such a sort of weighty word, isn't it? I don't know if I have an answer to that. What do you think of that?
I'm not being interviewed. It's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know. I guess migration is such an interesting thing, isn't it? That especially America is made of immigrants, and do they feel that their home is in America or in the place they came from? There's this amazing book title a few years ago, Between Two Kingdoms, and I think everyone has one foot in one place and one foot in another places, at least immigrants, I think.
Do you know what happened to the Jews who ended up in Galveston? Did you track them once they got to Galveston?
Yeah, I'm going to Texas in a week, and I'm meeting a few of the descendants of Galveston immigrants. Yeah, I think they weren't really allowed to stay in Galveston, so they scattered across Texas and really across many American states. I think that would be another book, but maybe someone else has to write it.
They seem to me kind of like, whereas the people like your family who moved to Palestine or Israel, as your family did, they were motivated ideologically, many of them. But the Galveston people, they were just like on the boat that were at the whim of your great-grandfather, sort of.
Yeah. I mean, there's one
not
article that I still think about, which is just this little line. It says, Texas may be a stopping point on the way to Jerusalem. That it was maybe thought of by some of the migrants or some of the organizers that these Russian Jewish refugees would go to Texas and wait until they could migrate en masse to a Jewish state in Palestine. And then obviously that didn't happen. They became Americans.
Right, it was like Ellis Island, south.
Right, yeah.
What was it like reconnecting with your family's past?
It was a mixed bag. I originally thought that my dad would be this main character of part 3. He's a documentary maker, and he spent his life asking people questions and knowing how to get the best out of people and make people travel back in time and reminisce. And everything I asked him, he said, "Oh, sort of. Yeah, I don't really remember." And then I guess with each person that you interview, you sort of see where their strengths and weaknesses lie in terms of their own memory. Some people could give me a really strong visual picture of the room and what the carpet was like in the room. Other people, like Jo, her memory seemed to be always entangled with world history. She remembered Roosevelt's fireside chats, and she remembered a lot of songs about Hitler that she used to sing in the 1930s.
Like the Disney cartoon.
The Disney cartoon. So it was just about sort of, yeah, finding people's strengths and weaknesses as interviewees.
How has the process of writing the book shaped the way you think about your own Jewishness?
I think it's just given me more of a sense of how un-Jewish I am and everything that has been lost in my own family. I mean, I kind of wanted it to make me reconnect with my Jewishness, but I don't know if it has.
How'd your family react to the book?
I think my sisters like the reviews. They like seeing a picture of me in the newspaper. My dad and his generation have loved that there's this monument to their childhood and to their family. It's been pretty positive. My dad actually took the longest to read it out of anyone, and eventually read it when it was a hardback and said, "I have a few changes." And again, it's like, please give me these 2 years ago.
Did the way that you wrote it make it harder to keep the emotional connections present? And did working with all the voices change how you saw your family?
Did it change how I saw my family? I think I thought of all these past generations of my family as sort of a bit irrelevant, and that really it was all a lead up to now and to my generation. Maybe you guys feel this as well, that especially when you look at old black and white photos of your ancestors or your grandparents, you think, oh, how sad for them that they're stuck in the past. They didn't know that 2025 is the real place to be. I think we feel that way, that everything is just almost sort of two-dimensional before you get to today. And actually, I realized writing this that, especially the early 20th century was probably way more vivid and relevant than, if so much more exciting than now.
Certainly the stuff they did, your great grandfather included, like, it's hard to imagine the world today without.
Are we doing things that are going to change the course of the next century? I don't know.
Right. Or who are the people who are doing that kind of thing? When you set out to put this book together, was it to write your family story? Like you said, you wanted to write about your dad. Was it primarily to focus on your family? Was it to try to situate it in the bigger context and the sort of the bigger sweep of history? Or just like go digging and see what you find? And
It was definitely to write about my family. I wanted to just be like a nice, normal family memoir. And then I kept on finding, as every family is, that my family was sort of entangled in all these world events. And I felt that I couldn't tell the story of the Galveston movement without telling the story of the founding of Zionism, and so on. With everything, it just all seemed to be tangled up together. And I think that's quite a nice thing, that families, especially in the 20th century, are inextricable from what was going on around them.
yeah, it's kind of amazing because when they were living in it, I mean, as we are, it's hard to imagine that we're sort of connected to these big events that are going to shape the world for generations. But you do such a beautiful job of it in the book of pulling those things together.
Today's episode was produced by me, Shayna Hammerman, with help from Eva Clem. Sound editing and design by Romy Kiorian. Original music is by Jeremiah Lockwood. Cite and Sound is a production of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford.
Stanford University.